Then I have an exploration project in South Texas. So you're putting a deal together and people are always asking you what's the ultimate reserves that you have on this deal, right? And you say, "Oh, I think this deal is 50 BCF." Well, how about you prove them to them what you think this deal is worth? And it's just a South Texas Wilcox play. So this is a really nasty looking but rough top of Wilcox map. I would also add, I have 30 square miles of 3D here. I do not have a single Wilcox test on this whole 30 square miles. So I am flying blind when it comes to the Wilcox and trying to estimate what's going on here. The structure is split by a fault, and it's about 6 miles long and about 2 miles wide, which is something very similar to Northeast Thompsonville, which has produced over 400 BCF of gas. I went and looked at a key attribute that we use in the Gulf Coast a lot, which is called sweetness. And sweetness is very good at identifying sands in the Eocene section and the Miocene Frio. And so my partner in this said, well, he wanted to go drill an 18,000-foot well to the house sand. And when I looked at the sweetness and saw nothing but blue in the lower portion of that, I said, there's no sand down there. Let's save our money and only drill a 13,000-foot well and hit these Hennett sands. And when I did my analysis, and here's the recipe I used, I went through principal component analysis. Now, in this case, unlike the first case, I had far angle stacks. So I was able to bring in some aspect of AVO into the mix to help reduce the risk. So I ran all of my attributes on the far angle stack and circled those levels which I believe to be sand, based on what I can tell from. We have a way of going into Paradise in each cluster and looking at the breakdown of the attributes that make up that cluster. So when you start seeing things like sweetness and energy absorption and attenuation and all the hydrocarbon indicators pile up in one neuron, then your level of confidence goes really good to say, I don't think that's coming from a shale. I think that's coming from a sand. So I identified a whole bunch of sands that we wanted to try to target. Given again that we don't have a Wilcox test on this, I don't know if these sands are wet. I don't know if they're low saturation gas. I don't know if they're good gas. We have to test them and then recalibrate the software. And this is what the conventional seismic looked like for the same directional survey that we wanted to hit. We do have gathers. Again, we have AVO, and we have a lot of type 2Ps and we have a lot of type 3s indicating, of course, we haven't calibrated this against anything because we have nothing to calibrate it against, whether these are in fact good AVOs or not. But what I started doing is I created geobodies, and I started going through each and every layer on both sides of the fault, calculating what I think the potential reservoirs would be if we drilled a straight hole on the west side and we drilled a deviated well on the east side. And I went through and put all of the geobody identifications, all the little pieces together that made up the sands, and put in my 4 parameters and came up with, for each layer, what I thought they would pull in BCF and liquids. And I went up and down, east side and west side. And you can see the picture of the geobodies that made up that piece that I'm showing on each level. There's 8 levels on the east side and there's 4 levels on the west side. And finally came up with, if we drill the deviated well and we hit all those sands and all of them work, that well is capable of making almost 40 BCF of gas. If we drill the east side, the west side, and hit all 4 sands, that well is capable of making almost 20 BCF. So this is a way of going in when you have an exploratory project. You have no control. You're trying to tell the people that you're hoping to invest in this deal, here's what I think the possibilities are. And then the beauty of something like this is you can go in and show every geobody. So if you are successful in your exploratory attempt, then you have a means to go in and cherry pick the best locations where you can get the maximum exposure on as many different levels of sand as you can get. So this is where the geobodies and the reserve calculations can really be important if you're selling deals or if you're buying properties or anything like that, or if you're looking at sweet spots in unconventionals. Well, what we did, there's a lot of production around us. So we looked at production around us and came up with what we were going to use for net to gross ratio. We had sonic logs nearby on dry holes, but we had sonic logs nearby. Not anything on the survey. This is as wildcat can be. That's it. Now I can tell the thicknesses because I know each of the samples. I have 1 millisecond sample rate in here, so I can count how many samples I've got in that body, and then using the estimated interval velocity, I can estimate how thick that is. And these sands are running anywhere between 50 and 100 feet thick, which is comparable to all the production around us. Well, part of the confidence in the sand aspect has to do with how many years of experience I have in the Gulf Coast of South Texas. Part of the confidence in the sand, again, has to do with looking at the makeup of each of these clusters and understanding the attributes and what those attributes are designed to help you see. So sweetness is an excellent attribute in the Gulf Coast for finding sand. And when sweetness is the #1 contributing attribute to that cluster, doesn't always work, but you have to go on some assumptions, especially as wildcat like this. Couldn't do this off the wavelet data, estimate the sands, or determine anything. So the best thing we could do is break it down by attributes, understand what the attribute contribution is to the neuron, and make the assumption that that meant sand. Because I had multiple hydrocarbon indicators for the key neurons that make up these different levels. When I have a neuron that starts with instantaneous phase, that doesn't get me excited. I have a neuron that starts off with sweetness and energy absorption, an envelope, things like that. Then I start to get a little bit more excited about that cluster. They're not always good for everything, but the combination of attributes and showing the subtle changes in the stratigraphy are what you want to do when you're interpreting. This kind of software is not going to get rid of interpreters. You're going to need interpreters with experience. You're going to need interpreters who understand what these attributes mean when they put them together in combination. That's the power of it. But the fact that you can see the stratigraphy and you can see all that kind of muddled color. There's some greens that stand out. There's some reds that stand out. There's some yellows that stand out. And then there's background noise. All that background noise is generally shale. And you want to look at the stuff that really stands out. And the green ones could be indications of wet. Until we drill this well and we have the ability to go back in to recalibrate what we see on the way down. But using this process to help estimate reserves and then being able to see all the geobodies that we think make up the sands is very valuable when it comes to developing the field. Because then you're not just poking holes every 160 or 320 acres. You're looking where you can optimize. When you recalibrate, you're looking where you can optimize the maximum number of geobodies with the greatest aerial extent to give you the best reserves.